Welcome to week 8. We're getting close now, and this section, this unit here is, as you can see, is on liturgics and church music. And for many of us, this is probably the fun stuff. I don't know how many of your patronuses explicitly addressed issues of church music or worship, but they're all involved in it in one way or another, and so you may have to dig a little more deeply. But we've got some theologians, and we've got activists, and we've got mystics, and most folks, that's not who they are. Their connection with the church or their connection with God is probably mediated mostly through weekly worship, and for many through some daily continuation of that. And so this is an important section, I think. Not any more important than any of the others, I suppose, but maybe more immediate to many people. And it seems to me kind of appropriate that just a couple weeks ago, you'll all remember that there was sort of a big deal, a big to-do in Rome, as Pope Francis canonized two of his predecessors, John the 23rd and John Paul II. John the 23rd, of course, was Pope in the early 60s and called the Second Vatican Council. And one of the things that came out of that council, when he wanted to open the windows and let the fresh air blow into the church, was what really turned out to be an incredibly powerful movement, and that has to do with liturgical reform. And you'll remember that I said that my liturgics professor, Matthew Shepard, was a Protestant observer at Vatican II. And I don't know whether or not, or how much influence Vatican II had on him and his work in the Episcopal Church with regard to worship, but I can't imagine that it didn't have at least some, especially given how involved Shep was in the development of the 79 prayer book. So, but Vatican II, wanted the language to be understood by the people, sort of a hearkening back to Luther and then the development of the Book of Common Prayer in England, that the people have to understand the language. And so the Latin Mass didn't go away, but certainly its presence in the churches around the world, the Catholic churches around the world, was much diminished, and English began to be used. And that also brought a shift in how music was done. And when I was in seminary, this was in the late 70s, I sang as a tenor in a Roman Catholic church. And we used this big hymnal that had all sorts of things in it that wouldn't have been there prior to Vatican II, including Martin Luther's "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," both in the kind of the original tempo and version that the tune went, as well as the one that probably we're more familiar with. So the change in music and the change in words and the change in everything as a result of Vatican II was immense. And so we see that in the 79 prayer book. And I just, as I mentioned the prayer book now, if you haven't read the preface, I know I've referred to it before, but if you haven't read the preface, go and just look at the preface. It's old. It's not a preface to this particular prayer book, but it does talk about the place of worship in the Episcopal Church. But in the 79 book, and I don't know how many of you remember the 28 book, but in the 79 book, we've got multiple languages. If you want to consider the traditional language as opposed to contemporary language. We've got multiple forms of the prayers, at least 4 in Rite 2. There are 2 in Rite 1. There are some alternatives that are also optional or are available. So we've got lots of different prayers. We've got 2 different sets of prayers for morning and evening prayer. In this prayer book, unlike in the 28 prayer book, we've added compline, we've added noonday prayers. So the options for worship are just really, really, really rich in there. Some of the ceremonies that used to be in separate books have been incorporated into the 79 book. And then, of course, we revised the hymnal. Again, I would call your attention to the preface to the hymnal, so you can understand why some of the changes were made. I don't know if any of you remember the 1940 hymnal. We played games with it when when I was in seminary. If you called out a hymn number, somebody would, the question was how fast could somebody just sing the hymn based on the number. We couldn't do that much anymore. But we were there for the revision of that hymnal, the 1982 hymnal. Certainly I was in seminary from 79 to 81. That was being worked on, and one of my professors was busy working on that part of our worship tradition, the hymnal. So we've made significant changes since Vatican II, and that has affected a lot of stuff. Some people would say it's diminished our worship. Other people would say it's enriched our worship. In fact, we've entitled a book, Enriching Our Worship. We've reincorporated much more scripture. We've changed who the participants are. So all of this is part of this work that we are doing in terms of leading or helping lead people in worship. And assuming you're ordained, you will be doing that in a way that you are not doing it as a lay person. But you need to be familiar with all of the stuff that goes on in the planning of worship, from the use of the prayer book to who's doing what, to what the music is. All of that stuff is what we'll spend a little bit of time talking about in this unit. Now, I don't know, I want to say before I click this one off, I don't know how many of you have taken Dean Eaton's class on liturgy. I know it's offered. I assume that many of you have. So again, this is not a class in the history of liturgics. It's not a class in the history of church music. It's a question of how do we pull all of these things together in a way that makes sense for the people with whom we minister.